I'm joined today by David Litt, who is a former speechwriter for President Barack Obama, also author of the book Thanks, Obama, My Hopey, Changey White House Years. David, it's so great to talk to you. I was very interested in the book. Let's start with how you ended up in this position of being a speechwriter, particularly at such a young age for President Obama.
I was one of those college kids. I graduated college in 2008, and I didn't plan on going into politics at all. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I interned for The Onion, the comedy newspaper. I applied to join the CIA and was rejected.
Hmm.
And on January 3rd, 2008, I was watching the free cable on a flight, that little plain TV in the seat back in front of me. And it was CNN was on, and Barack Obama was delivering his victory speech after the Iowa caucuses. And within a few minutes of watching that speech, I was one of those young people whose lives was just changed forever. I mean, by the time that plane landed, I was like, okay, whatever this guy is doing, I want to be part of that.
Does the CIA tell you why they've rejected you when they've rejected you?
They did in my case. They called me up and they said, let's just kick things off. Have you used any illegal substances in the last year? And I thought about lying to the CIA because I thought maybe maybe this is a test. But actually, I decided, maybe I shouldn't risk it. So I told them the truth. I had smoked pot 2 months earlier. It was my
Uh-huh.
21st birthday. And they instantly said, okay, well, that's it. Interview over. I remember they said, we like rule breakers, but in this case, we have to say we cut off the interview unless you've been clear of illegal substances for 12 months.
Got it. So you enter, and what are sort of the initial speech writing assignments that you do?
I started off at the White House as a speechwriter to Valerie Jarrett, who was President Obama's senior advisor. And in a lot of ways, it was a really lucky job because she knew both the president and the first lady for decades by the time I met her. And so I got an insight into the president that a lot of people maybe wouldn't have gotten a chance to because Valerie knew him so well. And then I also wrote for other senior staff. And for a long time, my niche with presidential speechwriting was basically what no one else wants to do. So if there was a videotaping that everybody else said, we're already busy this week and this doesn't seem like a lot of fun and we're hoping someone else can do it. I was that someone else for about a year or two and gradually picked up more and more responsibility as time went on.
So let's start with sort of those minor speeches. How much back and forth and revising is there, even for the really minor speeches?
For the really minor stuff, there was not a ton of back and forth with the president. So, for example, we would often take a big speech that week and condense it into that week's weekly address. I would sometimes do the condensing, but it's not like President Obama was meeting with us to say, well, I already delivered this speech, but this short version, is it good also? He would trust that the process would turn out something that was good enough for that. What we would have a lot of is back and forth with the chief speechwriter, who was John Favreau in the first term, my first few years there, and Cody Keenan in the second term. And both of them knew the president's voice really well and would be responsible for going through it and making sure that whatever I wrote or one of our other speechwriters wrote was something that the president wouldn't have to edit that intensely if it was smaller. And then the other thing we did a lot of was fact checking. So even the smallest videos were very intensely fact checked. I imagine that's sort of a contrast with the current administration.
I imagine so, yeah. Now, as far as writing for the president's style, what are some of the interesting particulars that you could share of things you sort of picked up in terms of the tone and style that would be written in?
Well, the biggest thing that I noticed about writing for President Obama, and it's one thing I share in the book, is he could read a run-on sentence in a way that most speakers cannot. I mean, if you're watching this or listening to this and you're thinking, I want to be a speechwriter, one piece of advice I would normally offer is write short sentences because most speakers can't handle long sentences. They get lost in them. President Obama was such a good uh, orator and had such a good sense of audience and timing that he could punctuate a sentence himself. So he could take a run on sentence and break it up naturally and build to these crescendos. And often those are the most inspiring moments in a speech. So it was actually something I almost had to unlearn and relearn when I started writing for him, because in the past I had been working very hard to keep sentences very, very short, and now is this chance to kind of unwind them and let him, his sort of natural, extraordinary talent shine through.
What in the world that you were in of speechwriting is considered sort of like a major accomplishment or success, and what would be sort of like a not so great moment?
Well, I think there's all sorts of different definitions of success. I mean, certainly a big speech like the State of the Union, or an important speech, something after a national tragedy. And I never held the pen on any of those. Those were usually the chief speechwriter, or maybe the deputy, one sort of rung down on the speechwriting ladder. But for me, it was, the biggest speeches I probably worked on were the Correspondents' Dinner speeches, the jokes. And the other thing I write about a lot in the White House is, in a way I didn't fully appreciate when I started there, what success looks like is managing to do your job in a way that doesn't derail what everyone else is trying to do in a big way, because little mistakes can have these huge consequences. I mean, in the book, I write about the time I accidentally caused an international incident. I write about a time when Fox News picked up on some small thing in a speech that I did, and it should have been innocuous, but it became a story for a day. And so every moment you're trying to not necessarily make history, not necessarily swing for the fences, but even in those less historic moments, you're just trying to get it right.
Let's talk about the Correspondents' Dinner. How did you get pulled into that? Was it because of your background with The Onion that sort of made people aware, like, hey, maybe we want to talk to David Litt about this?
Yeah, I had what in DC passes for a comedy background. So I had my Onion internship. I had done improv comedy in college. I started my speechwriting life as a writer at a firm called West Wing Writers, which is a private sector firm. And one of the speechwriters there, Jeff Nussbaum, has a niche where he writes a lot of jokes for public figures. So I had had some experience writing jokes for politicians too. And when I started at the White House, the speechwriter in charge of writing jokes was John Lovett, who's now host of Pod Save America, and moved to LA. And he moved to LA in November 2011. So it was really after he left that there was the sense of like, we need someone to be our in house token funny person, and no one else is there who's going to fit the bill. So by default, that kind of became me.
So when you're writing jokes, it would seem to me that the standard for evaluating how it went is very different than when you're writing a serious speech. I mean, how do you pay attention to how that speech goes over?
I think there were two important things for us. So one is when you're writing comedy, even for a politician, even for a president, it has to be funny. We were always trying to do stuff that was legitimately getting a laugh out of the audience. And it was easier for us than for many other speechwriters because President Obama has such a good sense of timing, but it still takes a lot of work. And I go into all that work in the book. The other thing that was important for me and for the team of people writing jokes was that in some small way, this was worth the president's time. So there's no question that going and doing a correspondence dinner was not the most important thing President Obama was going to do that month or that week, or sometimes even that day. But we still tried to think about, are we expressing our point of view? Are we maybe telling a little truth about Washington? Are we using self-deprecating jokes to make it clear that while President Obama takes his responsibilities seriously, he doesn't take himself too seriously?
Hmm.
So even the things that seem totally innocuous, you think if the president is going to put his own time into making this good, then we want to make sure it in some way helps him in his broader job.
So knowing what the process is behind the scenes, or at least what it was with President Obama, what do you make of, or what do you think is happening behind the scenes with the writing of the speeches given by the current president? And I don't know if maybe the problems come when he goes off of the written speech, and maybe if you have any experience in sort of managing that. Didn't really seem to be a concern with President Obama, but what's your analysis of what you see coming out in terms of presidential speeches right now?
So our goal, I think it's fair to say, when the speechwriting team that I was a part of, our goal was always to make President Obama sound like himself.
Mm-hmm.
Because with the speeches we wrote, I wouldn't, the highest compliment I could imagine for a speech that I wrote is it's the kind of thing President Obama would have written himself if he had the time. And I don't know that we ever got quite there, but the closer we got, the happier we were. Certainly the happier I was. I think, and in the book, I say that speechwriters are more personal trainers than puppet masters. They can make you present the best version of yourself to the world, they can't put words in your mouth and turn you into somebody you're not. And I think that is the challenge for the current crop of speechwriters in the Trump White House, because President Trump is who he is. And I think we see him when he doesn't have a script in front of him. We see a reflection of exactly who this person is. Sometimes you get the sense that the speechwriters are hoping to hide who he is by giving him remarks that, quote unquote, sound presidential, but it's not going to work in the long term. And so they're trying to do something that speechwriters have never been able to do successfully. And I think this group of speechwriters isn't able to do successfully, which is pretend that somebody is a different person than the one that we see regularly on TV. The other thing that's interesting about this group of speechwriters is I think they have more influence over the president than, particularly Stephen Miller, the chief speechwriter, than other speechwriters in the past, because Donald Trump is the kind of person who listens to the last person who was in the room. He doesn't have a thoughtful way of making decisions. And so what happens is, if Stephen Miller, the chief speechwriter, is the last guy to edit the speech, to talk to the president, he can manipulate the president into saying something that is closer to his kind of hardline white nationalist view of the world than maybe some of the president's other advisors.
Were there situations with President Obama where, for whatever reason, he would sort of start to depart from the written speech and riff? And if so, does that worry you that maybe he doesn't like what's been written? Or is it just sort of, hey, this is President Obama, he has this ability to do this, we don't worry about it?
In the first term, I think for the most part, President Obama was fairly, what's the right word? He placed a lot of stock in not ad-libbing unless he felt he absolutely had to. And the reason for that is that anything that you say in the first term of a presidency can be taken out of context and put in a political ad. So it's not just a question of what you're trying to get across, but whether someone can misinterpret that. And that's hard to judge and figure out on the fly. In the second term, I do think President Obama went off script a little more. I know with the jokes, there were one or two times he improvised a whole run of jokes, and you, to his credit, would never know just watching it which ones were scripted and which ones weren't. So to your question, honestly, there weren't a lot of times when he would go off script and I'd worry that it meant that he didn't like the remarks at all, because they weren't usually totally changing everything. Generally speaking, I was kind of curious to see what he would say, and also aware that odds were pretty good that that was going to be the part of the speech where, everybody, my friends and family, would say, like, that was amazing, did you write that part? And I'd say, well, I wrote the speech, like,
Right.
try to dodge the question a little bit. So we were very lucky. Not many speechwriters get to work for someone who, when they start to go off script, you think, oh, this is going to be good. I think a lot of speechwriters have the opposite feeling.
Yeah, particularly right now, I would say. We've been
I would
speaking
imagine.
with David Litt, former speechwriter for President Barack Obama. The book, which is fascinating, is Thanks, Obama, My Hopey, Changey White House Years. David, thanks so much for talking to us, and best of luck with the book.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.